Hello and welcome to Southwark Cathedral's podcast. And today I'm so delighted to introduce to you Jack L. High. Jack is an American journalist and author who focuses most of his work on the history of medicine, the history of science, and other historical topics. And he wrote a book about 13 years ago now, entitled The Nazi and the Psychiatrist, Hermann Göring, Dr. Douglas M. Kelley, and a Fatal Meeting of Minds at the End of World War II. It's a fascinating book that looks at the work of Dr. Douglas Kelley in the Nuremberg trials, talking to the 22 Nazi defendants at that international trial, but particularly focusing on the most senior of them, Hermann Göring. This book has recently been made into a film, and I went to see it at the end of last year, and it's absolutely fascinating, and you'll hear a little bit about it in the conversation that I have with Jack, about whether the Nazi mind is a sick mind, and if it isn't, then what is it saying about human beings? Anyway, here is Jack L. High. Jack, hello. It's very good to meet you, and thank you for joining me in this podcast.
Thank you for the invitation.
It was a wonderful thing to know that I was going to be talking to you, because it wasn't that long ago that I saw Nuremberg, the film, which of course is based on a book you wrote called The Nazi and the Psychiatrist. Maybe it would help if you just gave us a little resume of this book and how it came to be.
Well, the book focuses on the life and work of a military psychiatrist named Douglas Kelley, who at the end of the Second World War was called by the International Military Tribunal to try the top-ranking German officials who had been arrested. And the tribunal brought in Dr. Kelley to assess whether these 22 men who were to stand trial in the first court proceeding of the Nuremberg trials, whether they were mentally fit to be tried, which meant did they meet the rather low legal standard of mental fitness? Could they understand the charges against them? And could they participate in their own defense? And this was a very easy task for Dr. Kelley, and he did that quickly and took upon himself another project, more ambitious, to determine whether these men shared a psychiatric disorder that could account for their crimes and heinous behaviors before and during the war. I came across this story while researching an earlier book about another psychiatrist. That book is titled The Lobotomist. And through that research, I learned about Dr. Kelley and very sketchily about his work among the German defendants, and decided I needed to know more. So I went out in pursuit of archival materials or anything that could tell me about Dr. Kelley's career, and that search led me to Dr. Kelley's oldest surviving son, Doug, then living in Northern California, and Doug provided me with a wealth of materials of all kinds that illuminated Dr. Kelley's career, and also Doug was able to give me his own experiences with his father, which are very important in the book.
And a wonderful gift to a researcher.
Yes, I felt very lucky to have had access to all of that.
Tell me a little bit about, to begin with, because obviously we'll move on to Goring and the others, but tell me a little bit about Dr. Kelley.
Dr. Kelley was quite young when this work in Nuremberg began. He was only 33. And before that time, he had been working in military hospitals in Western Europe during the war, treating soldiers who suffered from what today we would call PTSD. Before that, he had attended medical school at the University of California and undergone other studies beyond that, and was treating patients clinically for several years. Dr. Kelley, at this time, was known to be a skilled interpreter of a psychiatric test called the Rorschach test, the test that many listeners might be familiar with because it asks subjects to interpret abstract ink blots. So Dr. Kelley came to his time with the Nuremberg defendants with quite a impressive career that he had built up given his relatively young age, and a lot of confidence that he put to good use when working with and interviewing the German defendants for this first trial.
And the trial itself was a bit controversial in some respects. I mean, they had to build, didn't they? I was struck by
Yes.
that. I never knew that. They built the courtroom for purpose.
Well, on one level, yes, the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg was selected because it had great symbolic value. That is the place in Germany where Hitler had held some of his biggest mass rallies. And there was a building, the Palace of Justice there, with a jail attached, which had a large courtroom, but it had been bombed by the Allies and was a wreck. And so that courtroom had to be rebuilt. But another aspect of the difficulty of getting the trial started was that this was the first time there had been an international effort to try the defeated war criminals of another nation. And the four major allies, the UK, US, USSR, and France, had to work out how this would happen. And not all of the allies were in agreement initially that there should be such a trial. But eventually, the idea persuaded everyone because of the value of showing the public of the world all the evidence that had been assembled already so soon after the war against these defendants. Also, that it was important that these men received a fair trial. This trial was not perfect. It was flawed, but it was fair. The defendants were allowed to mount a defense, and I think its fairness is evidenced by the fact that 3 of the defendants were acquitted.
And there are some quite fascinating photographs, aren't there, from that trial? Various facial expressions being pulled by some trying to look very indifferent to it and some looking pretty agonized by it all.
Many photos were taken of the defendants in the dock, all sitting next to each other on benches. And these were the highest-ranking military and civilian leaders of the German government. The very highest in rank was Hermann Göring, who actually had not committed suicide like many of the other top-ranking German leaders had, including Hitler, because Göring believed that there was a chance that the Allies would allow him to run and lead a transitional government in Germany. The Allies had no intention of doing that ever, but Göring had persuaded himself it was a possibility. So he allowed himself to be arrested, and that's why he ended up there among his former colleagues.
He seemed to be a person who persuaded himself of quite a few things.
Yes, and he was persuasive. He was highly intelligent. He had a great deal of charm, a wonderful sense of humor, and political perception. But as Dr. Kelley found out when he started spending time with Göring, along with the others, there was a very dangerous and dark aspect to Göring's personality, too. He had no sense of remorse for the events of the war. He had no conscience, and he had no empathy for the victims in the war. all of this added up to making him a formidable counterpart as they were having their long interviews and discussions in Goring's prison cell.
Let's come back to Goring in a moment, but just give us a sense of 3 or 4 of the others who were there, perhaps the more famous of the 22 that were on trial, apart from Goring. Who else was there?
Probably the best known of the other defendants was Rudolf Hess. And Hess had made a name for himself during the war by, on his own initiative, flying a plane from Germany to Scotland, bailing out and demanding to speak with the British authorities to try and broker a peace or an arrangement between the German and British governments to unite and fight against the Russians. And the British government was not interested in that and locked up Hess right away. He spent the remainder of the war imprisoned. And when the trial began, then Hess was sent to Nuremberg to join his fellows there. And Hess was very interesting because of his high rank, but also because he, at various times during his captivity, feigned mental illness or mental disorder. He claimed to be a victim of amnesia at different times, then denied it, and then claimed it again. So he was one of them. Another interesting defendant was Julius Streicher, who actually was not a German government official, but the publisher of a influential newspaper and very anti-Semitic newspaper in Germany called Der Stürmer. And there were many other interesting people. Alfred Rosenberg, who was kind of a party philosopher among the Nazis. Albert Speer is fairly well known still today. So these were people, there were military men also among them. So it spanned the whole breadth and width of the German government and military service.
And I'm right, I think, am I, in remembering that Hess was actually imprisoned in the Tower of London?
Yes, he was.
It's an extraordinary thought every time I go past it, that it was still being used as a prison.
And he tried to kill himself, or at least made a halfway attempt at doing that, by throwing himself down some of the stairs in the tower. But he did not hurt himself very badly.
So let's come to Goring, because certainly in the film, he is the person who gets most attention. He was the most senior, presumably, of the 22 there. And Dr. Kelley starts having long conversations with him. What's he discovering as he talks to this man? What's going on here?
The most important thing that he discovers initially is that Goring is a master manipulator, forming within his own mind his defense. He knows he will be tried. He knows he will probably be convicted and sentenced to death. But during the trial, as a way to make a case for Nazi Germany and to make a case that their cause, even though they lost the war, their cause was just. Kelley was not uncomfortable in dealing with a master manipulator like Goring because Kelley himself was quite skilled in the art of manipulation. And together they manipulated each other. Goring wanted closer contact with his family, his wife and daughter, who were outside the prison. And he convinced Kelley to carry letters between the prison and where Emmy Goring was living with their daughter, Etta. This also was under the table. It was not sanctioned. And then in return, Kelley wanted access to Goring, not just to discover more about his psyche, but also to learn more about why Goring and the other Germans followed Hitler so devoutly, why they broke treaties so easily. how they defended their behaviors, all of that. And eventually, Kelley did pass on some of that information to the prosecution in the trial. Kelley found out that Goring was a very skilled, complex, and dangerous person, and that he would need to be treated carefully once the trial began.
And he's approaching this as a medic, really asking, he's asking if the Nazi mind is a sick mind.
He wanted to know whether these Germans had a common disease, psychiatric disease among them. And that's really how Kelley occupied most of the 8 months or so he spent with the defendants before the trial and then once it had started. And Kelley went into all of this with the operating hypothesis that there was a disorder that explained them. But in the course of using a battery of psychiatric tests on them and interviewing all of the men extensively, he reluctantly came to the conclusion that they did not share a psychiatric disorder. And not only that, none of them possessed any kind of psychiatric disorder, that in Kelley's estimation, all of these men fell within a normal range of personality. This was upsetting to Kelley because it cast doubt on the value of psychiatry in dealing with men like these, but also, even worse, by suggesting that these men were normal. That meant there are others like them, also normal, all around us, in every country, every era, and that the end of that long, terrible, bloody war would not put an end to people with authoritarian desires, tendencies, and thirst for power, and the thirst to exercise power over others. The war would not stop that. There would be others. And when Kelley returned to the States after Nuremberg, that's what he devoted himself to for a while, trying to convince Americans that this could happen in the U.S. or in any democracy, and that we should prepare.
Well, you've led me very nicely into something, of course, I wanted to pursue a little bit, is do you think we're seeing a rise of this sort of mentality at the moment in various parts of the world?
Most certainly we are. And we're seeing, in my country, in the U.S., we're seeing a rise in authoritarian political movements. We have a president who embraces those. We're seeing less respect for the highest law of the country, the U.S. Constitution. And I think that some of the remedies that Douglas Kelley put out there in 1947 when he wrote his book, 22 Cells in Nuremberg, would benefit us now and people in other countries who are facing similar authoritarian movements and swings to the far right. One of the prescriptions that Dr. Kelley made to help preserve democracies is that these countries, he felt, must emphasize critical thinking in their educational systems, from the very youngest children to those in university and beyond, forming opinions and reaching decisions after examining evidence from a variety of sources and determining which sources are reliable and which are not, instead of relying on our emotional responses to form opinions and make decisions. Dr. Kelley also believed that in the U.S. in particular, when he returned to this country, it was very obvious that there were demagogues afoot, especially in the American South, where racist politicians had instituted Jim Crow laws and restrictions on voting by black voters in particular, and even more than that, uses of propaganda to play upon the emotions of the electorate. And so Kelley advocated for efforts and laws to make voting easier for qualified voters, not harder. And right now in the U.S., we're seeing a concerted effort in the U.S. Congress to pass legislation that makes it more difficult for eligible voters to vote. There's no question that there's a rise in authoritarianism all around the world now, and that Dr. Kelley's methods that he recommended would most probably help.
I remember reading a few years ago a book called Hitler's Willing Executioners, which was not about executioners, but about the general public of Germany at the time, going about their daily lives, having families, going to church, all of whom ended up either being quietist or supportive, many of them, of these big personalities with their Nazi worldviews. So there was a sense in which it was contagious, if I can put it that way, that people who might have known better suddenly found themselves breathing in an air which perhaps they couldn't even see anymore. But do you think, first of all, do you think that's an accurate interpretation? But do you think that's also something that our own world at the moment needs to be aware of? Is not so much, as it were, the demagogues of our time, but actually the general populace of the time.
In the book, you mentioned Hitler's Willing Executioners. The focus was on followers. And these are people who were unable or unwilling to think critically and allowed their emotions to be played upon or allowed apathy to set in. And we're definitely seeing that now in many parts of the world. And Dr. Kelley, because of his circumstances, when he was in Nuremberg, he was focusing on not the people following orders or receiving propaganda, but those leaders who were giving it. And he developed his ideas about the leaders of such movements. And then others since then have gone on to look at the followers and those who carried out or ignored. And I think the psychology of both groups is different. Kelley became, quite knowledgeable about the leaders, and others since have become knowledgeable about the followers.
We had a preacher here not too long ago who reminded us of Mr. Must during the Vietnam War, who stood outside the White House holding a candle. Eventually, a journalist said, Mr. Must, do you really think you're going to change the world standing here holding a candle? And he said, I'm not here to change the world. I'm here to make sure the world doesn't change me. And it seems to me that we need that warning as the warning about our leaders.
That reminds me, that story of the famous photograph, I wonder if you're familiar with it, taken at a Nazi rally in Germany during the war at some point, where everyone is lifting their arms in the Sieg Heil, except for one man who has his arms down and is looking on defiantly right in the middle of the crowd. And that, I think, expresses much the same idea, a man who refused to let himself be changed or persuaded. And such people are strong, and not everyone is like that.
No. Were you pleased with the way the film came out?
I am pleased with it.
Great.
I feel relieved that I can honestly recommend it to my friends and acquaintances. I like it because it is essentially factual. I don't think we should expect any movie based on history to be entirely factual, and Nuremberg isn't. But it is factual in the important points. And also the movie gets across what I think are the most important messages from my book about Dr. Kelley's work and the importance of international cooperation in achieving justice. When the world has seen war crimes, crimes against humanity, these are crimes that affect all of us, not just the victims who may be in a small number of countries. I think that really came across over the many years that Nuremberg was in development. I reviewed and commented on 4 different drafts of the screenplay that the director, James Vanderbilt, had written. And I had to think a lot about who am I commenting as? I did not want to be a fact checker. And of course, I'm no expert in how to write a screenplay either, whereas James Vanderbilt is. So the role that I settled upon was doing whatever I could, commenting however I could, to help this become the best movie possible. A movie that entertains, also instructs in its way, and moves the audience. I think that is very important. And I think Nuremberg does all of those things.
I was very pleased to see it. Of course, Goring, as you say, a manipulator, and even manipulates the very end. He escapes justice by killing himself.
Hermann Göring was among the majority of the defendants who were convicted of these horrible, serious crimes, and he was among those sentenced to death by hanging. Göring applied to the court to be executed in another fashion. He wanted to be executed by a firing squad, which he felt was more dignified in keeping with his perceived station. He thought of hanging as a punishment for highway robbers and low forms of criminals. And the court denied that. So on the eve of his execution, Göring took a cyanide capsule that had been issued to him before the end of the war by the German government. And cyanide produces a very quick, although painful, death. The question is, how did Göring possess this cyanide capsule? Because his cell was searched regularly, his body was searched regularly, and no one knows, really. But the most likely explanation is that he made an arrangement with one of the American guards that the guard would remove one of these cyanide capsules from Göring's belongings that were in storage and give it to Göring, and in exchange the guard would get something of value. Göring arrived at the time of his arrest with all kinds of jewels and medals and watches and things of value. So in doing that, Göring was making a statement to the Allies. I'm not going out the way you want me to. It was an act of defiance. And one of my questions in entering my research and writing The Nazi and the Psychiatrist was, is there a connection between this suicide of Hermann Göring and the suicide that Douglas Kelley accomplished himself 12 years later, using also cyanide as the poisonous agent? And I determined there was a connection, although it might not be what you would first think of, which might be perhaps that Kelley had imitated Göring in his form of suicide. But I think because Kelley and Göring were similar men, that making a dramatic statement and a dramatic form of suicide at the end appealed to them for similar reasons. Kelley, too, had a statement to make about how his life had gone after Nuremberg. He was very unhappy and depressed. A lot of things had gone wrong in his life. He may have been thinking of Göring, but that wasn't the driving force, I don't believe.
Well, it's such a fascinating story of a tormented and tormenting period of history, which, as you say, in many ways is quite close to us and maybe even getting closer. So a film for our time, and certainly a book for our time. I feel many people from Southwark Cathedral will be running out to get your book after this podcast. I certainly hope they will be. And Jack, I'm just really grateful for this conversation, and thank you for being here with us.
Oh, it was my pleasure, and thank you for your thoughtful questions. I appreciated them.